Hola amigos, I'm Jeff from Worldwide Cyclery and I'm here to do a bike review on the Orbea Rallon.
Oh my god, dude.
Well, if you didn't already go, leave a comment and get really upset at how I just pronounced that. I'm well aware that it's Orbea Rallon, but I'm not actually sure if it's Rayon or Rayon. I don't speak Spanish, I'm not good at it. But Orbea is a Spanish bike brand. They've been around for a super long time. I think since 1930. They make a ton of different bikes. In the US, I've always known Orbea as a little bit more of like a road and XC brand. They've done a lot of XC sponsorship over the years that I've seen and always kind of recognized their brand sort of on that segment of the industry. But recently, in the last year or two, they've come out with a lot more enduro and longer travel mountain bikes, this being the most notable one, which is a 150 mil travel 29er. And that is kind of a crowded segment right now in terms of bikes, and there's a ton of different ones out there. This thing definitely has some unique characteristics about it that I really liked, and let's dive into that. So in the crowded market of long travel enduro 29-inch wheeled frames and bikes out there, what makes the Rayon unique? So first thing that I think is really cool is Orbea's Myo customization program, and that's where you can buy these things directly from them and you have an incredibly amazing ability to adjust every single color. So if you go to their site, you can just select different frame colors, different logo colors. You can custom build it with different parts. It's pretty incredible what you can do there, and I like that. It really allows you to sort of customize a bike, not just based on parts, but in terms of paint and all the options you have there, which is probably, you know, thousands of them if you play around there. So definitely check that out and poke around with some colors. That's one of the more unique things about the Rayon. Next thing, the sort of look of the frame and the suspension design is pretty unique and cool. So it's obviously using this carbon brace right here that's on the same, like one side of the frame and not the other. It's a little bit specialized. I don't know if this actually came out before the Enduro did or not, but definitely has a really unique sort of eye-catching look to it. Concentric rear axle pivot. That's similar to like what Salsa's, Da Vinci's, and Treks are using. It's actually a really cool design. I'll get into a little bit more of how that works and why it's unique and why it works quite well in the next section of this review on how it goes on the trail. As far as geo goes on this thing, so it's not too crazy. I think when this bike came out, which was a little over a year ago, it was probably a little more on the aggressive side. A lot more bikes have come out since then that have probably taken it even further in terms of like being long and slack and low and all of that. So it's not really, I kind of like it. It's not too crazy aggressive, but it's not, it's definitely not old school by any means. So it's a 65-degree head angle. It is adjustable with this right here on the rear shock, so you can put it to 65 or 65.5. 76-degree seat tube angle, which is pretty solid. It's not the steepest, but it's definitely not a slack seat tube angle by any means. These things do come in just a small, a large, and an XL. I've been riding the large, and it's not a crazy long reach or anything, so it's a 444 reach on the large. So keep that in mind when you're looking at bikes. Bike sizing is a whole nother topic to dive into, but I'm 5'8". I felt comfortable on the large. I actually put a little bit longer stem on it and liked that as well. I wouldn't call this a long bike, but I wouldn't call it like a short old school bike. It's kind of like right in the middle, which is pretty nice. It's not over exaggerated in terms of like ultra progressive geometry, but it's definitely not old school by any means. So those are some of the unique things about it that I definitely liked about it, and let's talk about how it works on the trail. I had a ton of fun riding this bike. I spent most of the time riding it out in North Carolina in the Asheville area and Brevard specifically, and the DuPont trails if you've been there. So when I first got on this thing, I started climbing, and that was initially like my first impression of the bike, and I was impressed. I think in terms of 150 mil travel 29ers, this thing climbs as absolute good as anyone I've ever ridden. Super good in terms of just pedal efficiency is awesome. The wheelbase is not overly long, so getting this thing around a tight switchback climbing or just technical climbing in general is awesome. Like, it's super agile and just wants to lean into like a tight corner when you're climbing, and you just feel like you're pedal and when you're pedaling, it's just, the bike moves. It's awesome. It's a great climber for being a 29 150 bike. So if you're okay, climbing a 29 150 bike, this definitely climbs the best of all of them, which is really cool. Descending. So descending, we could talk a little bit more about the split pivot frame design. I don't think Orbea actually calls it split pivot. That's sort of what some other brands call it, and Trek, I believe, calls it ABP, active braking pivot. So that is this right here. It's a concentric pivot right on the rear axle, and the idea behind this thing, as far as I understand, is really about separating braking and suspension. So it's to make the suspension stay completely active under braking. And the first bikes I ever rode that were like this were the Da Vincis and the Treks, and I actually really enjoy that, because you notice it in sections when you're in rough stuff and it's steep and you're on the brakes. The suspension definitely does feel just a lot more active and planted and stuck to the ground. But where I actually notice it more and really like, and I noticed it right away on this bike, so some of those trails I wasn't super familiar with, and probably all of us have ridden trails for the first time, and you make mistakes in corners where you're in sort of a sweeping corner and you're just going too fast and you have to hit your brakes. Obviously, you shouldn't technically be braking in corners, but that totally happens on trails that you just don't know, especially if you're trying to follow someone who knows the trail really well and you realize like you overcooked a corner. When you overcook a corner and you end up having to get on the brakes, which is just something that happens, especially when you're riding trails you're not familiar with, this thing just still stays planted to the ground, probably better than any other suspension design. And I definitely credit that to sort of that pivot being right on the rear axle. And I really like that. This bike felt like it had a ton of traction. It was really good, just pumping through corners. It really wanted to stay planted and stick to the ground, especially when you're on the brakes, which was awesome. So it also was, to me, I mean, I think everyone has a different opinion of what bikes feel playful and which ones feel sort of more planted and like not playful. This thing initially with the X2 shock, to me, felt like pretty planted and not really super playful. It took a little bit of time to figure out how much I needed to yank on the bars to get the front wheel off of the ground, how much I really needed to like manipulate the bike with my legs and hips to like get it to break loose on the rear end. It definitely feels more planted and stable, probably more so than other bikes. So in my opinion, it's more of like a planted, stable bike. The X2, I love it on a downhill bike. I feel like on an enduro / trail bike, it's a little over damped and maybe makes the bike feel a little too, I don't know, just not lively enough. I also rode this thing with the RockShox Super Deluxe. That made it feel a lot more lively. I didn't spend a huge amount of time tuning this thing. You can get them from Orbea with this shock or a coil shock. So that's something to consider if you get this thing, and spend some time adjusting your shock to try and get it to have that feel that you want. But this thing right off the bat is definitely more of like that planted, plowing, like downhill rough style shock, as opposed to like a lively, light feeling trail bike shock. Chainstay on this thing is 435. So again, like most things on this bike, it's not overly progressive, but it's not old school Geo by any means. So not a crazy short chainstay, but not long. Yeah, overall wheelbase, not super long either. For more of the tech specs and stuff like that, check the link below in the video description to go to the blog article where we sort of break down a lot more of that. But overall, I really like this bike. Definitely a fun ride, and to me, something that is my favorite is really just that suspension design, which again is similar to what's on Salsas and Treks and Da Vincis. Having the pivot on the rear axle, I really do think works good and has some really good characteristics to it. So yeah, that's kind of like my take on what was unique about this bike when I rode it and sort of how it compares to other bikes in its class. So now let's dive into the pros and cons. So, pros and cons of this bike. So right off the bat, I think in terms of pros, climbing. This thing definitely climbs super well, and of all of the long travel 29ers I've ridden, this thing climbs like the best of them. A lot of that has to do with the suspension design and the anti-squat, and also just the wheelbase and it being able to maneuver quickly at low speeds and things like that. But climbs incredibly well for its class of bike. Stability and control, so that's more of a descending thing. I definitely like that suspension design, especially like I mentioned earlier on the on-trail performance, how it works under braking, especially when you screw up and you end up hitting your brakes in a corner, and how the thing just doesn't let the tires break free. It just has awesome traction throughout. It just feels like a really good, stable, safe bike that, in my opinion, is probably a bike that's going to help any rider go to the next level. It was interesting. So BKXC, Brian Kennedy, is a good friend of ours. He rode a Rallon, I think, for like the last year, and he loved it. And riding with him, I'd probably hang out with him every 6 months or so. And once he got his Rallon and then going to ride with him the next time, I was like, damn, dude, you're way faster at riding your bike now. And he definitely credited a lot of that to that bike. He just thought that this bike made him feel more confident and, you know, just more stable. And like, he just became a better rider on that bike, which I think is cool. And a lot of that to me is credited to like a good suspension design that stays planted and stays, you know, grippy and has traction that you just feel good riding. Another pro, custom colors. I think that's absolutely awesome. I mean, Orbea is really coming to the game with something unique there in terms of being able to do all those custom colors. That's totally, you know, I don't know anyone else who's doing custom colors like they're doing. So yeah, definitely check out their site and poke around there. That's killer. Another pro to this bike, the geo's not too crazy. So a lot of brands these days are getting pretty friggin' aggressive when it comes to how slack they are, how long they are, all of that sort of stuff. And this thing's just not too crazy, which I think is a pro because it's just not wild. But you could also consider that a con, right? Like if you're looking for a bike that's like cutting edge, super progressive, you really want a long wheelbase and a crazy slack head angle, then like this isn't your bike. So that's kind of a pro and a con. The stash pack, this thing has a little mount right here that you can obviously put your CO2s in a tube and a tire lever and whatever else you want in there. I really like that idea. And then you can also put a, I believe, 500 milliliter water bottle in here too, even with the X2 shock, which is pretty nice. That's definitely a pro to a bike. Some bikes can't use a water bottle on. Cons. Not super playful. I think that's probably a bit of an opinion. When I rode this thing, that's kind of how I felt initially. It just took a little bit longer for me to get used to it. And again, could be a con if you're really looking for a playful bike, but if you're not the kind of rider that's like slashing your tires all the time or bunny hopping or jumping or hopping around the trail, if you're not that kind of rider, then that's a pro, that's not a con. So that's definitely sort of an opinionated thing. A lot of it too has to do with the shock and just sort of the way you set your suspension up in general. If you set it up a little bit, you know, with sort of just less rebound and less damping, and like depending on what suspension you put on it, you can get it to be a little bit more playful. So I don't know, pro or con, I guess that's sort of an opinion. To me, I prefer my bikes a little more playful than this thing felt, but this thing definitely has that sort of like stability and control factor to it that is really cool. Like I mentioned before, not too crazy geo, so that's a pro and a con depending on what you're looking for in a bike. I guess sort of the last con you could say would be the cost. These things are pretty expensive. So the frame and shock alone goes for $3,999, which is pretty steep. The bikes start at $5,400, yeah, $5,499, and they go all the way up to 10 grand. You can custom build them to God knows how much. When you're looking at a sort of boutique Spanish brand and you're considering that and the custom colors and all what, you know, everything that goes into that, you're probably not like a super price sensitive buyer to begin with. If you're price sensitive and you're really looking for just like squeezing every penny out of your bike, you know, maybe that's the price of this bike is a con. But if you want something rare and gorgeous and unique and custom color, like you're gonna pay a little bit of a premium for that, but you get your money's worth. These things are absolutely gorgeous. So hopefully that sums up the review for you guys. Let us know down in the comments if you've ridden one of these, if you're considering riding one. Make sure to check that link below in the video description for the blog post where we go into more detail about sort of like on the trail thoughts and all the tech, geo, and charts, everything in there. Yeah, that's about it. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and we'll see you guys in the next one.